He controlled the entire bloodstream of a newborn nation. Alexander Hamilton commanded the treasury, designed the revenue system, built the first national bank with $10 million in capital, 5 times larger than every other American bank combined. He made presidents bend. He made Virginia aristocrats grovel. Yet 30 years earlier, this same man fought rats for rotten fish scraps on a Caribbean dock. He was legally classified as a whore child, barred from church schools, watching his mother rot in a Danish prison cell for the crime of leaving a sadistic husband. His mother died in a fever bed beside him when he was 12. The courts seized her corpse and her possessions, leaving him with nothing, not even the right to inherit the smell of her memory. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore, condemned by law and scorned by God, become the architect of American capitalism? Perhaps because he understood what the Virginia plantation owners never could, that power doesn't flow from bloodlines. It flows through ledgers, and he controlled every line. The air in Christiansted, St. Croix, didn't smell like paradise. It smelled like an open wound festering under tropical sun. The scent that dominated everything was molasses, thick, cloying, metallic, boiling day and night in the sugar mills that ringed the harbor. The boiling houses never stopped. Enslaved men fed cane into iron rollers that could crush bone as easily as stock, while the juice bubbled in massive copper kettles, reducing life to syrup to profit. The smell stuck to skin, to clothes, to memory. It mixed with something worse, the stench that rolled off the slave ships docked in the harbor, a miasma so dense that 18th century doctors believed it could kill by proximity alone. Contemporary witnesses described it as a stench so offensive as not to be imagined. Dysentery, unwashed bodies packed like cargo, death fermented in Caribbean heat. This was the smell of commerce. This was the smell young Alexander Hamilton breathed every day while working the docks. He lived in the shadow of European order, but was excluded from it. The Danish had built Christiansted with Enlightenment precision. Yellow brick buildings with red roofs, Fort Christiansvern dominating the harbor with geometric certainty. But Hamilton existed in the chaos beneath that order. He watched hogsheads of sugar, each barrel weighing hundreds of pounds, rolled by enslaved laborers whose muscles were the true currency of empire. He lived on Company Street, above a cramped shop, in rooms that stank of vinegar and sickness. His mother Rachel sold provisions to plantation owners who would never invite her inside their homes. She had been something once, born into island aristocracy, taught French and the manners of the elite, but a disastrous first marriage had destroyed her. Her husband, Johann Michael Lavian, was the first villain in Hamilton's story, and he taught the boy a lesson that would shape American history. The law is a weapon wielded by those in power to crush those without it. In 1750, Lavian had Rachel imprisoned in Fort Christiansvern, that imposing yellow fortress, for months. Her crime? Flirtatious behavior and refusing to live with a man she despised. She sat in a Danish dungeon, pregnant or newly delivered, locked away by a husband who used the courts like a cudgel. When she finally escaped and fled to St. Croix, when she found love with James Hamilton and bore 2 sons, Lavian tracked her down through the legal system. The 1759 divorce decree was his final revenge. It forbade Rachel from ever remarrying and legally designated her future children as whore children, illegitimate issue born of adultery. This wasn't playground cruelty. This was binding law. Alexander and his brother James were marked by the state as obscene, as stains, as non-persons. They had no right to inheritance, no claim to legitimacy, no path to respectability. The Anglican Church on Nevis formalized this exclusion when they barred Alexander from their school. His birth was too dirty for education, so he learned in the streets, in the counting house, through books his mother somehow acquired despite their poverty. He read by candlelight in rooms that sweltered even at night, the pages sticking to his fingers in the humidity. He read about Plutarch's heroes and European kings while his own legal status placed him below the poorest legitimate white child on the island. The diet of poverty tasted of salt and desperation. While plantation owners imported European delicacies, the poor whites and enslaved population ate the same food: salt fish, dried cod from North America that had to be soaked for hours to become remotely edible, and cornmeal. The fish was pungent, tough, heavy with brine. Root vegetables when they could afford them. No fresh meat, no variety. Malnutrition was as common as the fevers that swept through the island, turning skin yellow and filling graveyards. Alexander's body learned early that survival meant enduring scarcity, that hunger was a companion as constant as the smell of molasses. February 1768 brought the defining trauma. Both Alexander and Rachel contracted fever, likely yellow fever, the invisible executioner of the Caribbean. They lay in adjacent cots, or perhaps the same bed in their cramped room above the shop. The space was suffocating, thick with the smell of sickness and the desperate ministrations of the poor. Vinegar to clean, rags soaked in water, useless prayers. Rachel's body broke first. The fever consumed her while her 12-year-old son lay paralyzed beside her, too weak to move, listening to her breathing slow and stop. He was too sick to attend her funeral. He lay in the bed where she died, the sheets still carrying her smell, sweat and sickness, and the last traces of lavender water she might have used. He survived the fever that killed her, waking to find the space beside him empty, his mother's corpse already removed. The cruelty didn't end with death. Johann Michael Lavian, the villain from the past, emerged like a specter to claim Rachel's estate for his legitimate son Peter. Because Alexander and James were whore children, they had no legal standing. The court seized everything. The books Rachel had collected, the furniture, the small stock of goods from the shop. Everything vanished into legal proceedings designed to remind the boys of their worthlessness. Alexander and James were left with nothing but the clothes they wore and the knowledge that the system was designed to erase them. His mother's possessions, her memory, even her few pieces of furniture, all became property of the man who had imprisoned her decades before. The law had taught Alexander Hamilton its final lesson. Without property rights, without legal standing, without financial power, you own nothing, not even grief. He could have rotted in that room. He could have joined the hundreds of poor whites who drank themselves to death on cheap rum, who became overseers whipping enslaved workers, who disappeared into the anonymous mass of colonial poverty. Instead, Alexander Hamilton decided to gamble everything on ink and paper. The hurricane that hit St. Croix on August 31st, 1772, was an act of God that felt like the end of the world. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore roofs from buildings like pages from books. The sea rose and swallowed the docks where Hamilton had worked, turning the harbor into a churning cauldron of debris and drowning men. Buildings that had stood for decades collapsed into splinters. The boiling houses went dark. The carefully ordered Danish architecture crumbled under nature's fury. In 6 hours, the hurricane destroyed what had taken generations to build. Hamilton was 14 years old, working as a clerk, and he watched the apocalypse with a writer's eye. While others cowered or prayed or looted, Hamilton sat down and wrote a letter to his absent father. But this wasn't a private confession. It was a calculated performance. He knew exactly what he was doing. He gave the letter to Hugh Knox, a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor who had taken interest in the brilliant bastard boy. Knox published it in the Royal Danish American Gazette on October 3, 1772. Hamilton was broadcasting his inner life to the only audience that mattered, the educated elite who controlled access to escape. The letter dripped with theatrical religiosity and sublime terror. He wrote of fiery meteors flying about in the air, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed. He adopted the voice of a philosopher confronting mortality. "Where now, O vile worm, is all thy boasted fortitude and resolution?" This was a teenage clerk addressing the universe like he was John Milton. He described the wind's roar, the crash of falling houses, the moment when human order dissolved into primal chaos. But embedded in the purple prose was something more dangerous: intelligence. The letter proved he could think, could write, could transform raw experience into structured argument. He was signaling to the powerful men of St. Croix that his soul was too large for a counting house stool. The gamble was enormous. If the letter had been dismissed as pretentious or mocked as the delusions of a bastard clerk playing philosopher, Hamilton's intellectual ambitions would have been crushed. The island society was rigid, hierarchical, suspicious of those who reached above their station. But the letter worked. It shocked the merchant class into recognition. Here was a mind that could be useful, that could be saved, that might even reflect glory back on them if properly cultivated. They began collecting money, contributions from men who would never have invited Hamilton's mother into their homes, but who recognized the utility of genius when properly harnessed. The deeper education, however, had already occurred in the 4 years since his mother's death. Hamilton didn't attend university before arriving in America. He attended the counting house of Beekman and Kruger, and it was a more practical school than any college could have offered. He learned the mechanics of empire from the inside. Nicholas Kruger's firm dealt in the commodities that defined the Atlantic world: sugar, rum, mules, lumber, and human beings. Hamilton's job was to manage the flow. He tracked shipments, calculated exchange rates, inspected cargo. He learned that sugar was measured in hogsheads, that rum was vulnerable to evaporation in tropical heat, that mules were currency for Spanish colonies, that timber fed the British Navy's endless appetite for raw materials. But more importantly, he learned that the entire system ran on credit, on paper promises backed by the threat of legal force. A merchant's word was only as good as his ability to collect debts, and collection required leverage, social connections, legal standing, the willingness to use courts and sheriffs and, if necessary, violence. The Caribbean was a chaos of currencies: Danish rigsdalers, Dutch guilders, Spanish pieces of 8, British pounds sterling, Portuguese joes, all circulated simultaneously, their values fluctuating based on silver content, political stability, and merchant trust. Hamilton had to calculate exchange rates in his head, converting one colonial currency to another while tracking multiple shipments across multiple colonies operating under different legal systems. This mental gymnastics rewired his brain. He stopped seeing money as coin and started seeing it as pure abstraction, a shared hallucination that only worked if everyone agreed to believe in the same fiction. This understanding would later allow him to conceptualize a national debt as a national bond, to see $75 million of liability as $75 million of liquid capital that could be leveraged into infrastructure and industry. In 1771, when Nicholas Kruger fell ill and sailed to New York for treatment, he left the firm in the hands of his teenage clerk. Hamilton was 14 years old. For 5 months, he ran the entire operation. He gave orders to ship captains, men 2 or 3 times his age, scarred by sun and violence, accustomed to authority, and they obeyed. He fired incompetent employees. He inspected cargo and rejected shipments that didn't meet quality standards, writing harsh letters to suppliers about "your flour is too coarse" or "your lumber is inferior." He managed thousands of pounds sterling worth of transactions, directing the movement of goods across the Atlantic. One letter from this period survives, and it reveals everything. Writing to a ship captain, the teenage Hamilton instructed, "Reflect continually on the unfortunate voyage you have just made, and endeavor to make up for the considerable loss therefrom accruing to your owners." The tone wasn't pleading, it was commanding. He wrote like someone born to authority, someone who expected obedience. He had learned the most important lesson of power. Confidence is a weapon. If you act like you deserve command, people assume you must. But there was a darker education happening simultaneously. Hamilton saw the machinery of the slave trade up close. Beekman and Kruger dealt in blackbirds, the euphemism for enslaved Africans. He inspected these human cargoes, noted their value in ledgers, calculated the profit margins. He watched the brutality required to maintain the sugar economy, the whips and chains and casual violence that kept the entire system functioning. This proximity to slavery didn't make him an abolitionist, not immediately, but it tattooed certain truths onto his psyche. He understood that societies run on force, that without the threat of violence backing every transaction, the whole elaborate structure collapses. He understood that labor had to be controlled, disciplined, made predictable. These weren't the lessons of a Democrat. These were the lessons of an administrator who would later deploy 13,000 troops to crush farmers who refused to pay whiskey taxes. The money for his passage to America came from an unexpected source. While textbooks credit local merchants or Hugh Knox, probate records tell a different story. Anne Lytton Venton, Hamilton's first cousin, appears to have siphoned funds from her father's estate to pay for Alexander's escape. Entries dated May 1772 show debits of 120 Rigsdalers, 1 hogshead of sugar, and 1 hogshead of rum paid to Nicholas Kruger. Payments that align precisely with the costs of passage and initial expenses in America. Anne was a woman, so her role was erased from the official narrative. But the numbers don't lie. While the men in Hamilton's family abandoned or crushed him, the women, his mother Rachel, his cousin Anne, fought and paid for his survival. In the fall of 1772, Hamilton boarded a ship bound for Boston. He carried letters of introduction from Hugh Knox and enough money for 1 year of preparatory school. He was roughly 17 years old, though his exact age remained uncertain even to him. He wore clothes that were clean but threadbare, spoke with the accent of the Caribbean, and carried the rage of a man who had been trampled by every institution designed to maintain order: the church, the courts, the class system. He was leaving behind the smell of molasses and rotting fish and slave ships. He was leaving behind the yellow fortress where his mother had been imprisoned. He was leaving behind the graves of everyone who had loved him. But he was taking something with him more valuable than money. He understood how empires worked. He had seen the ledgers, managed the flows, calculated the exchange rates. He knew that power flowed through institutions, banks, treasuries, legal systems, and that whoever controlled those institutions controlled reality itself. America didn't know it yet, but a feral genius in a clerk's suit was coming to build their future, and he would construct it in his own image, rigid, ordered, unforgiving, and designed to ensure that no one would ever strip him of everything again. The grind wasn't military. Hamilton fought in the Revolution, yes, served as Washington's aide-de-camp, commanded troops at Yorktown, proved himself brave under fire, but that wasn't where he built his power. The real grind happened in the years after the war, when the Continental Congress was bankrupt, when soldiers rioted for back pay, when the states hoarded revenue like feudal kingdoms, and when the entire revolutionary experiment teetered on the edge of collapse. Hamilton looked at this chaos and saw opportunity. He saw a nation that could be shaped, molded, forced into structure. He saw a blank ledger waiting to be filled. By 1789, when George Washington appointed him the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton was 34 years old. He had already written most of the Federalist Papers, had already designed the constitutional framework for executive power, had already married into New York aristocracy through Elizabeth Schuyler. But he was still the bastard from the Caribbean, Still the boy who had watched his mother's possessions get seized by courts. Still the clerk who understood that everything, honor, safety, identity itself, could be reduced to numbers on a page. And now he had control of the nation's finances. The United States owed $75 million. To understand the scale, the federal government's annual revenue was barely $5 million. The debt was crushing, impossible, a weight that made foreign governments laugh and domestic creditors panic. State debts varied wildly. Massachusetts owed millions from financing the war. Virginia had paid most of its obligations, and everyone accused everyone else of corruption and favoritism. The continental currency had collapsed into worthlessness. The phrase, "not worth a continental," becoming synonymous with trash. There was no national bank, no unified currency, no system for collecting taxes. It was anarchy dressed up as a republic. Hamilton wrote 3 reports in his first 2 years that restructured American capitalism: the report on public credit, the report on a national bank, and the report on manufactures. Each report was hundreds of pages of dense financial argument, and each was a weapon aimed at creating the world Hamilton wanted. A world where the federal government possessed overwhelming power, backed by overwhelming wealth. He worked 18-hour days, writing by candlelight in his home on Wall Street, his violet blue eyes scanning columns of numbers, while his wife Elizabeth managed a growing household of children. He drove himself with manic intensity, as if he could outrun the poverty of his childhood by drowning it in productivity. The core of his system was brutal in its elegance. He proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, take the $75 million, and consolidate it into a single national debt. States that had paid their obligations would still pay. States that hadn't would be bailed out. This seemed insane, unfair, a recipe for sectional warfare. But Hamilton understood something the Virginia planters didn't. Debt isn't a burden when properly managed. It's a tool. By creating a massive pool of federal bonds, he was creating a new asset class that the wealthy could invest in. He was binding the richest men in America to the survival of the federal government. If the government collapsed, their bonds became worthless. Therefore, they would fight to preserve federal power. He traded the location of the nation's capital to get this passed. Jefferson and Madison wanted it on the Potomac, near their Virginia estates. Hamilton didn't care about geography. He cared about financial architecture. So he met them for dinner, made the deal: assumption of state debts in exchange for a Southern capital. It was the most consequential dinner in American history, the moment when Hamilton bought the future with present compromise. Jefferson later realized he had been swindled, that Hamilton had used the capital as a distraction while fundamentally transforming the relationship between citizen and state. The Bank of the United States followed with mathematical inevitability. Hamilton proposed a bank capitalized at $10 million, 5 times larger than all other American banks combined. The federal government would own 20%, private investors 80%. The bank would issue currency, make loans, hold government deposits, and essentially function as the central nervous system of the American economy. Jefferson and Madison screamed that it was unconstitutional, that the Constitution didn't grant Congress power to charter banks. Hamilton responded with the doctrine of implied powers. If the Constitution granted Congress power to collect taxes and regulate commerce, then Congress possessed implied power to create institutions necessary to execute those functions. This argument would later justify everything from the interstate highway system to the Federal Reserve. Hamilton wasn't just building a bank. He was rewriting constitutional interpretation to concentrate federal authority. The numbers from his peak are staggering. By 1795, federal revenues had increased from barely $5 million to over $8 million annually, and Hamilton controlled every dollar. He built the customs houses that collected tariffs, designed the system of import duties that funded government operations, created the Coast Guard to stop smuggling, established the mint to produce currency. He wrote Washington's major policy statements, effectively ghostwriting presidential authority. Cabinet meetings became Hamilton interrogating Jefferson while Washington watched. He was 5'7" and weighed perhaps 140 pounds. But he dominated rooms filled with generals and planters and men who owned thousands of acres. His weapon was information. He understood the numbers better than anyone, could recite tariff schedules and bond yields from memory, could bury opponents in avalanches of data. But power demands sacrifice, and Hamilton paid in ways that hollowed him out from the inside. The same manic energy that let him restructure American finance made him vulnerable to disasters that more cautious men would have avoided. In the summer of 1791, a woman named Maria Reynolds appeared at his door in Philadelphia. She claimed her husband had abandoned her, that she needed money to return to New York, that she had heard Secretary Hamilton was generous to those in distress. Hamilton gave her $30. Then he visited her lodgings that night. Then he began an affair that would nearly destroy everything he had built. James Reynolds, Maria's husband, wasn't absent. He was orchestrating a blackmail scheme. He discovered the affair and demanded payment. Hamilton paid, and paid, and paid. Over the following year, he transferred nearly $1,300 to Reynolds, roughly $40,000 in modern currency, in a desperate attempt to keep the affair quiet. The irony was vicious. The man who managed millions in public funds, who designed systems to prevent corruption, who built his reputation on financial integrity, was being extorted by a semi-literate con artist. In 1797, when political enemies accused him of financial corruption, of using treasury funds for speculation, Hamilton made a choice that reveals everything about his priorities. Rather than remain silent, rather than let suspicion linger, he published a pamphlet admitting to adultery to prove his financial innocence. The Reynolds pamphlet was 95 pages of self-immolation. He included Maria's love letters, James's blackmail notes, receipts for the hush money, every humiliating detail to demonstrate that the cash payments weren't public corruption, but private sin. "This confession is not made without a blush," he wrote, "and you can feel the humiliation bleeding through the ink." He chose to destroy his marriage, to publicly shame his wife Elizabeth, to give his enemies ammunition forever, because he could not tolerate the accusation that he was financially corrupt. His identity as an administrator was more important than his identity as a husband or father. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton endured this public degradation with dignity that should have broken her. She was the daughter of Revolutionary War General Philip Schuyler, raised in manor houses, educated in grace and propriety. She had given Hamilton entry into the New York aristocracy that would have been forever closed to a Caribbean bastard. She had borne his children, managed his household while he worked through the night, and created the domestic stability that allowed his career. The Reynolds pamphlet repaid her with humiliation. Yet she stayed. Whether from duty, from love, from lack of options, or from understanding that Hamilton's demons were too powerful to fight, she stayed and raised their children and buried her anger so deep that history can barely detect it. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 revealed the authoritarian core that Hamilton had always carried. When Pennsylvania farmers refused to pay his whiskey excise tax, a tax designed to pay the national debt he had consolidated, Hamilton didn't advocate for negotiation or compromise. He urged Washington to raise an army of 13,000 militiamen, a force larger than most battles of the Revolution. When Washington agreed, Hamilton rode west with the army, finally playing the military commander he had always wanted to be. On November 13th, 1794, in western Pennsylvania, federal troops conducted raids that locals called the Dreadful Night. Soldiers kicked in doors in the pre-dawn darkness, dragged men from their beds into the snow, arrested suspects without warrants. Hamilton personally interrogated prisoners, searching for evidence of conspiracy and treason. Prisoners were tied back to back, marched through freezing temperatures, held in unheated basements without adequate food or water. This wasn't law enforcement. This was state terror designed to send a message. The message was simple. The federal government will crush resistance to its authority, and Alexander Hamilton will personally lead the crushing. Most of those arrested were eventually released without trial. There was no grand conspiracy, just poor farmers who resented attacks on their primary means of converting grain into portable value. But Hamilton had made his point. Federal power was real, backed by force, and opposition would be met with overwhelming violence. The Virginia planters who had grumbled about assumption, and the bank suddenly understood that Hamilton's financial system had teeth, and those teeth could tear flesh. The cost of this power was measured in more than political capital. Hamilton's son Philip, his eldest, his pride, internalized his father's code of honor. The code that said insults must be answered, that reputation was everything, that a man's name was worth dying for. In 1801, when a lawyer named George Eaker called Alexander Hamilton a rascal in a 4th of July speech, 19-year-old Philip confronted him at the theater. The confrontation led to a duel. Philip Hamilton faced Eaker at Weehawken, New Jersey, on November 23, 1801. He followed his father's advice to withhold his fire, to demonstrate honorable restraint. Eaker shot him in the hip. Philip lingered through the night in agony, dying the next afternoon in his father's arms. Hamilton's grief was total. He had watched his mother die in a fever bed when he was 12. Now he watched his son die from a bullet wound caused by Hamilton's own obsession with honor. "Beyond comparison, the most afflicting of my life," he wrote to Benjamin Rush. "He is now out of the reach of the seductions and calamities of a world full of folly, full of vice, full of danger." The bitterness in that sentence reveals a man who had spent his life trying to impose order on chaos and had just learned that chaos always wins. His son was dead because Hamilton had taught him that honor mattered more than life. The code that had driven Hamilton from Caribbean poverty to American power had killed his child. After Philip's death, Hamilton became a ghost, haunting his own life. He still practiced law, still wrote furious political pamphlets, still attended dinners, and spoke with that penetrating intensity that had always marked him. But something fundamental had broken. The manic energy that had driven him to work 18-hour days, to write thousands of pages restructuring American government, to dominate every room he entered, it all turned inward, curdling into something darker. He picked fights he couldn't win. He attacked Aaron Burr with obsessive venom, calling him dangerous and untrustworthy in private letters that somehow always became public. He was courting disaster with the deliberation of a man who had already decided how the story would end. Aaron Burr had been Hamilton's mirror image and opposite. Both were brilliant, both ambitious, both outsiders clawing their way into power. But where Hamilton built systems and institutions, Burr built networks and alliances. Where Hamilton wrote treatises on fiscal policy, Burr seduced widows and collected favors. Hamilton had spent his life trying to construct permanent structures that would outlive him. Burr lived entirely in the present, a man of charm and surfaces who believed in nothing except his own advancement. Hamilton despised him with the special hatred reserved for people who remind us of our own suppressed possibilities. When Burr ran for governor of New York in 1804, Hamilton campaigned against him with a fury that seemed divorced from political calculation. He told anyone who would listen that Burr was unfit for office, that he was dangerous, that he possessed neither principles nor restraint. At a dinner party in Albany, Hamilton allegedly said something about Burr's character that went beyond the normal boundaries of political insult, something despicable, according to the letter that eventually reached Burr. The exact words were never recorded, but they were enough. Burr demanded an explanation. Hamilton refused to give one. The letters went back and forth, each more rigid than the last, both men trapped in the machinery of honor that required blood to satisfy insult. July 11th, 1804, 7 in the morning. Weehawken, New Jersey. The same ledge of rock overlooking the Hudson where Philip had died 3 years earlier. Hamilton wore his glasses, green-tinted spectacles that might have protected his eyes or might have obscured his vision, and carried a pocket watch and a prayer book. He and Burr had been rowed across the Hudson separately, the oarsman pretending not to understand what was about to happen. The pistols were the Wogden dueling pistols owned by Hamilton's brother-in-law, the same weapons that had killed Philip. They contained a secret, a hidden switch that created a hair trigger setting, reducing the required trigger pressure from 10 pounds to barely half a pound. Hamilton knew about this mechanism. Burr almost certainly did not. What happened in the next 30 seconds has been argued over for 2 centuries. Hamilton and Burr took their positions. The command was given. Hamilton fired first. His shot went high, snapping a tree branch 12 feet above Burr's head. Then, Burr fired. His bullet hit Hamilton in the lower right abdomen, tore through his liver and spine, and lodged near his left hip. Hamilton crumpled, paralyzed instantly from the waist down. As he fell, he whispered, "This is a mortal wound, doctor." Did Hamilton deliberately fire into the air, staging a noble sacrifice? Did the hair trigger mechanism cause an accidental discharge when Hamilton was hit and flinched? Did he intend to kill Burr, but simply miss? The mystery matters because it determines whether Hamilton's death was martyrdom or mechanical failure, whether his final act was one of moral courage or involuntary spasm. Hamilton had told his second that he intended to withhold his fire, to demonstrate that he valued life over honor. But he had also set the hair trigger, had also brought the same pistols that killed his son to the same location. A man who truly valued life would have refused the duel entirely, would have apologized or clarified or simply let Burr's anger exhaust itself. Instead, Hamilton went to Weehawken knowing he wouldn't shoot to kill, but also knowing that Burr would. It reads less like courage and more like suicide with plausible deniability. They rowed him back across the Hudson to New York. The bullet had destroyed his internal organs and severed his spine. He lay in agony in a borrowed house, surrounded by doctors who could do nothing except administer laudanum and wait. He asked for communion, but was initially denied by the Episcopal bishop. Dueling was a sin, and Hamilton had chosen his death. Eventually, a minister relented. Hamilton took communion, made peace with whatever God he believed in, and died at 2 in the afternoon on July 12, 1804. He was either 47 or 49 years old, depending on which birth year was correct. Even in death, his origins remained uncertain. But his system survived. That was the final revenge of the bastard orphan who rebuilt himself as the architect of American power. The Bank of the United States was eventually destroyed by Andrew Jackson, but the principle of federal financial authority became permanent. The assumption of state debts created the precedent for federal supremacy over state sovereignty. The customs houses and revenue systems Hamilton designed funded American expansion across a continent. The doctrine of implied powers that he articulated to justify the bank became the legal foundation for nearly every expansion of federal authority in American history. From the Interstate Highway System to the Environmental Protection Agency to the Affordable Care Act, every Supreme Court decision that favored federal power over states' rights was built on arguments Hamilton had first sketched in candlelit rooms in the 1790s. The most profound legacy was invisible. Hamilton had transformed American capitalism from a theoretical possibility into a functioning reality. He had proven that a republic could operate on credit, that debt could be leveraged into investment, that financial markets could replace aristocratic bloodlines as the organizing principle of society. He had built the machinery that allowed the United States to industrialize, to wage global wars, to become the economic superpower that would dominate the 20th century. The Virginia planters, Jefferson and Madison and the others who had fought his every proposal, built their vision of an agrarian republic on the foundation of slavery. That system collapsed in 1865. Hamilton's system is still running. Walk through Lower Manhattan today, and you walk through Hamilton City. The New York Stock Exchange, the Federal Reserve Bank, the towering headquarters of investment firms and hedge funds, all of it traces back to the financial architecture he designed in the 1790s. Every time Congress debates the national debt, every time the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates, every time the Treasury Department issues bonds, Alexander Hamilton is in the room. He died in 1804, but the machine he built became immortal. The tragedy is that Hamilton spent his entire life running from the chaos of his illegitimate birth, from the chaos of the slave economy, from the chaos of the hurricane, toward the safety of order and structure. He built systems and institutions and legal frameworks because he believed that rigid order could prevent the kind of arbitrary cruelty that had destroyed his mother. But order requires violence to maintain itself. The Whiskey Rebellion proved that. The 13,000 troops marching through Pennsylvania snow, the prisoners interrogated in unheated basements, the federal power crushing local resistance, that was Hamilton's order made flesh. He had fled from the brutality of the Caribbean only to become the administrator of a different kind of brutality, more systematic, but no less real. His grave is in Trinity Church Cemetery in Lower Manhattan, surrounded by the financial district he essentially invented. The tombstone is simple, dignified, giving no hint of the Caribbean poverty, or the Danish prison, or the fever bed where his mother died. Tourists visit and take photographs, most of them drawn by a Broadway musical that has transformed the feral genius into a romantic hero. But if you stand there quietly, if you ignore the traffic and the skyscrapers and the tourists, you can almost sense the truth. Alexander Hamilton won. Not the man. He died at 47 with a bullet in his spine. But the system, the architecture, the machine he built from nothing, that achieved a kind of immortality that would have satisfied even his monstrous ambition. Every dollar that changes hands carries his ghost. Every debate about federal power versus states' rights echoes arguments he first articulated. Every time the government uses its authority to override local resistance, Hamilton's precedents provide the legal justification. The bastard orphan who was legally designated obscene, who watched his mother's corpse hauled away by bailiffs, who fought rats for scraps on a Caribbean dock. He built the American superpower from nothing because he understood what the comfortable never learn. That power isn't inherited, it's constructed. And if you build the right structures, if you design the right systems, if you control the flow of money itself, you become more permanent than any bloodline, more enduring than any throne. The smell of molasses and rotting fish is gone. The yellow Danish fortress is now a tourist attraction. The boiling houses are silent. But walk into the Treasury Department. Look at the organizational charts and revenue systems and bond markets. And you're looking at the ledgers of a teenage clerk from St. Croix who refused to disappear. Alexander Hamilton lost his mother, his son, his reputation, and finally his life. But he won the future, and the future is still paying interest on the debts he consolidated in 1790.